Okay. The book of Job, it's a shame we've got one day to spend on Job, but one day. One of my mentors, Dean McBride, who was mainly a Pentateuchal scholar, once said that the book of Job is the second most important book in the Bible. And McBride went on to say, I'm not really concerned what the most important book is, and we could debate about that. Maybe it's the Gospel of Matthew, or Paul's letter to the Romans, or the Psalter, or Deuteronomy. You could make a case for any of those and others perhaps. But McBride insisted Job is always, or should always be, the second most important book. What he meant by that is that Job is something, regardless of where else we're reading, that ought to always be in our minds. It ought to always come up to us and raise questions for us, because it raises the most crucial questions of human existence: the meaning of suffering, what is this life before God and with one another as we experience hardship? How do we make sense of all that? So Job indeed is a book that should always be read and be at the forefront of our thinking about the theology, the prayers, especially the complaints that we encounter. And in that sense, we'll see quite a lot of overlap between Job and the Psalms that we've talked about. We're going to talk about a number of different dimensions of the book of Job, starting with its structure and then kind of walking through its content. The final question I want to ask, though, is what is, in fact, the meaning of this book? Many have thought that this is a book that tells us about the meaning of suffering, which, in fact, it does not do. You search in vain to have any definitive answer to that. So if it doesn't do that, what does it do? And I think it does offer us something really important related to suffering in the absence of any clear answer about why we suffer. So with that, that's our ultimate goal. Let's start with the structure of the book, which is part of the meaning of the book, as always. And the structure is actually quite fascinating. It begins with two chapters, sometimes labeled a prologue, that give us narration about Job set in the heavenly realm in God's heavenly court. So we'll say more about that in a moment. We'll just note that this is narrative, and in the lingo of narrative critics, the narrator here is an omniscient narrator. This is one who knows what's going on. The conversations between God and those around God's throne. God and the other divine beings who go out to do God's bidding. You would have to be omniscient to know that. And so that's the perspective it comes from. Over at the other end of the book, then, the book will close off with narrative in chapter 42. And this is sometimes, although these labels are not completely adequate, call that an epilogue. And it consists of Job 42, 7 through, that's the final verse, through 17. It also is narrative. So we begin with narrative and we end with narrative. But in the middle, the bulk of the book, the dialogues between Job and his friends, companions, as well as two others that we'll mention, is written in poetry. So I'm going to, kind of diagramming the structure of the book, I'm going to put the dialogues up here. Because the dialogues are in poetry, and poetry is a style that is more lofty, that, as you know from reading the Psalms, filled with figures of speech, with metaphor, with language, and with techniques of speech that you simply can't pull off in narrative. The difference between narrative and poetry, has long been debated, and some would argue that everything is poetry or everything is narrative. Most don't believe either of those, really. But where we draw the line between narrative and poetry is a big debate. In Hebrew poetry, the difference has primarily been identified as the use of parallelism. And as you know that from your reading on the Psalms. And we see that used in beautiful ways in Job. So the dialogues, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. The dialogues include a number of sections. 3:1 through chapter 31. 31:40, gives us the interaction between Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. So Job and his, who are these people? We'll talk about that in a moment. His friends. They don't seem much like friends at times, do they? Then a really interesting part of the book is chapters 32 to 37. Another character is introduced, Elihu, and he gives a long series of speeches in which he argues against Job, but more than that, he argues against Job's friends. It argues for God's righteousness. Then 38 through 41, we have the speech of God. The Lord speaks to Job out of the whirlwind. There's one brief place, chapter 40, verses 3 to 5, where Job answers God in the middle of the speech. But otherwise, this is all divine speech, the Lord addressing Job. And then finally, 42, 1 to 6, Job responds to God. And as we'll see, that final speech of Job is the key to the meaning of the book. And the problem is that the key verse, verse 6, is far from certain as to its meaning or how it should be translated. But we'll get to that in just a little bit. This shift from narrative to poetry back to narrative really makes Job quite unique. Kind of like, and what is the reason for that shift? It's kind of like in an odd way, the shift we see in the film The Wizard of Oz. You know, we start out in black and white and we end in black and white, but in Oz, everything is in color. It's an interesting technique. Job sort of works that way. There's just an article, just most recent issue of the Journal of Biblical Literature, that in fact asked this question. And when I saw the question, which is just, why do we have poetry in Job? I thought, you need to ask that question. That's something that's been worked over quite a bit, hasn't it? And indeed it has, but the article in a very learned way kind of goes through the various answers and notes that, you know, we don't really have a good, clear answer to that, although a lot of proposals. What this article basically says, which sort of makes a lot of sense, is that simply things can happen in poetry that can't happen in narrative. And Hebrew narrative is a development of a genre or a style that allowed storytelling in a way that really kind of anticipates the kind of biography and storytelling that we have in the modern world. It's really an innovation, but poetry is always the place where figurative language and complex dialogue is possible. And so that seems to be the reason the centerpiece is poetry. Sometimes the difference between narrative and poetry in the book have been explained by positing different authors and editors, you know, and while Job, like all books of this size in the Bible, is likely indeed a complex book, and we can identify maybe multiple layers of work on it, the difference between narrative and poetry in general can't be explained just because of that. It seems to be a purposeful use of poetry in the book to get us into these dialogues, to let the things happen that happen there. And I think we'll see the narrative and the poetry are quite aware of each other. And there's a resolution to some of the questions as a result of the mix of those two. So we'll come to that in just a little bit. Let's think about the character of Job first as the book opens, and walk through sort of what happens in the book. And then we'll get to Job's response to God eventually and talk about the meaning of the book or possible meanings of the book. The book opens by introducing Job as an ideal character. Though the setting of the book and the time of the book is completely open. And there are debates about when this book was written and when it is set, and there's never been any kind of definitive answer for either one of those. There was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. And that expression, that little formula is going to come up again and again. Blameless and upright, feared God, and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. It's maybe accidental or maybe not that in the Baal epic, the tales about the Canaanite god Baal, he has 7 sons and 3 daughters, and there's some interesting parallels between the two. Job is presented as this idealized figure, not as a divine figure, but as an ideal figure, and maybe draws from some of that influence. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. The 7 and 3s that appear, like the numbers of his children, reflect kind of the perfected numbers. 7, we know, after the days of the week, or a week has 7 days, that's the perfect number. 3 also is one of those complete numbers, and it seems to be tied to our psyches almost. Our brains are wired around threes. When you think even cross-culturally, how many stories have three movements? Think about the parables of Jesus, and how many of them have three events, and it's the final one, or maybe a fourth one after the three that set everything up, that give us the real point to the story. How many jokes have you heard, where so-and-so goes into a bar, and it always happens three times? So that's true of biblical literature too, and we find it in interesting ways, like in Joshua, on the third day, or after 3 days, something happened. What's he talking about? It's after a complete period of time. All this sets up the idea that Job is this ideal character, and he is ideal in his faithfulness to God, and he seems to have been rewarded for it. And then we also see something of his piety in verse 5. When feast days had run their course, Job would send, talking about his children who get together and celebrate. He would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of all of them. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did. The opening of the book sort of sets us up to believe that retribution theology is a real thing. That is, if you live a certain way, if you fear God and turn away from evil, good things will happen to you. You'll have thousands of cattle and sheep. You'll have many children. Things will go well with you. That's the way the story starts. We'll see how that goes as it moves on. Job is also this religious character, religious to a fault. He not only makes sacrifices for himself, but for his children, for fear that maybe they have sinned and have failed to make their sacrifices, and so he does it for them. Things turn in verse 6. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord. Now here we have a picture in the heavenly realm that we've seen before. We saw it in Psalm 82, for example, where the Lord took his place as the head of the divine council, and we've seen it in a number of, we'll see it in some prophetic reports of prophetic call, but here we see it in a really developed way in Job. And at the end of verse 6, and Satan also came among them. We have to explain a bit here. The translation here of this word is highly debated, and it's a difficult one to carry off by our translators because of the tradition that lay behind it. But the word in Hebrew has a definite article, and the word Satan means accuser. And I think that's important. This figure has a particular role in the heavenly court. The accuser, he's not a personification of evil, although we can see how that might develop from this, that here's this character who is against Job in ways and challenges God, but that has to come in time. In Job itself, Hasatan, the accuser, is simply one of God's heavenly members of God's heavenly court. He is sort of like the prosecuting attorney. His job is to go out and to examine human beings, to see people who are doing wrong and to bring their case back to God. Now, again, this sort of reinforces this retribution theology. Here is a character in God's court who is going out and finding people who are doing wrong things, bringing their case to God, presuming that God is going to then punish them for the deeds that they've done. The Lord said to the accuser, "Where have you come from?" He answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." This perhaps was intended as a rhetorical question. I'm not sure God is looking for an answer, but the accuser gives one anyway. The Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, all that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So the narrator tells us that we've got this bargain that takes place in the heavenly realm. The accuser is given power to take things away from Job as a kind of test to see how upright and pious he indeed is. So what follows in verses 13 through 22 is that all of Job's possessions are taken away. His flocks, his herds, and his children all are killed. Verse 20, Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshiped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. We get in the narrative at the beginning that stereotype, or that caricature, I should say, of Job as one of great patience. All this happens to him, and he doesn't complain to God, doesn't cry out against God, but simply blesses God for everything he had came from God, and that he doesn't have it now. Well, that's what he started with. So then the next scene in the heavenly court. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, the accuser, "Where have you come from?" And the same answer. The Lord said, "Have you considered my servant Job? He sure passed every test, hasn't he?" And we repeat the initial characterization of Job. He's blameless, upright, fears God, turns away from evil. He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him. The word integrity really captures who Job is. He is consistent no matter what is happening in his life, expresses his faith the same no matter what. Then the accuser answered the Lord, "Skin for skin. All that people have, they will give to save their lives. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, he is in your power. Only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Job took a potsherd with which to scrape himself and sat among the ashes. Then we have the one other human character who enters, Job's wife, who says, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Job already seems to be questioning retribution theology. This idea that if you do right, you will always receive reward. Job now is in mourning. He mourns his own condition as he mourned the loss of his children and all his possessions. He sits on an ash heap and with this potsherd scrapes his sores. It's a horrible, horrible scene. The narrative ends then with the three friends coming. Now, when Job's three friends heard of all the troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamite. They met together to go and console and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was great. Now, something's going on here, I think, that may be important for the larger interpretation of the book. The three friends or companions come to comfort Job, but the word here may have a technical meaning. The root in Hebrew is naham. We're going to see it several times in the book. It seems to mark the role of those who come to end a period of mourning, or to be with a person during a specified period of mourning, I should say. That's what the comfort is. It's as it says here, they don't speak to Job. They don't try to encourage him. They don't say everything's going to be all right. None of that's going on. Their comfort is almost ritual. And they sit together 7 days and nights. It's, again, this complete period. It's the prescribed mourning period. Now, what if that's right, and I think that is right about what's going on here, what we might expect, or what the friends might expect at the end of the 7 days, is for Job to get up and say, whatever condition I'm in, the official period of mourning is now over. We've gone through our ritual. Now we move on. But that's not what happens. We go from sitting on the ash heap to continuing to sit on the ash heap instead of getting up off it. And the dialogues, it seems, then take place there. Notice that he hasn't moved. There's no account of that. What happens between chapters 3 and 31 all seem to be there in a state of mourning as it just continues. So here we get then Job's complaint. Job's protest, if you will, about the ending of mourning. It starts with a curse of his birth. Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said a man-child was conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, or light shine on it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds settle upon it. Verse 8, let those curse it who curse the sea, those who are skilled to rouse up Leviathan. Job seems to be cursing creation itself and his birth as a positive sign of God's creative work. Notice the mention of Leviathan here in verse 8. Those who rouse up Leviathan. Leviathan is that primary symbol of chaos, and we'll see another such symbol later in the book as well. But Leviathan and the sea are primary images and representations of those parts of the world thought not to be brought under the order of God in creation. And Job essentially says that's what this all really is. There is no real order. There's no goodness to the creation. That seems to be the meaning of the curse of his birth. The first of his companions speaks in chapter 4, and then we're going to have this series of Job speaking and complaining, and then his friends refuting him. Just to note that the first, Eliphaz, seems to repeat the orthodox position, the retribution theology, or the assumption of retribution theology with which the book began. Verse 6, is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? Think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? You always get rewarded for being faithful to God. That's the message. But of course, Job won't have any of it. And that's basically the nature of the dialogues, is Job arguing against this. The three companions, the so-called comforters, refuting Job, and on it goes in a cycle. Chapter 7 is one of those places where the argument of Job comes again to undo the traditions that everything makes sense in God's creation, that it all fits together neatly. Here, Job questions the nature of human beings and the place they have in the created order. Remember, and we'll see in this chapter, Job asked the same question that appears in Psalm 8. What are human beings that you pay attention to them? Psalm 8 gave that lofty answer. It may be a surprise, but you've made them a little lower than God, made them a little lower than you yourself. That's who human beings are. And you put them in charge of the rest of creation. Job 7 calls all that into question. Do not human beings have a hard service on earth? And are not their days like the days of a laborer, like a slave who longs for the shadow, and like laborers who look for their wages? So I am allotted months of emptiness, and nights of misery are apportioned to me. When I lie down, I say, when shall I rise? But the night is long, and I am full of tossing until dawn. Over in the middle of the chapter, we get to the questioning then of the nature of humankind. Verse 16, I loathe my life. I would not live forever. Let me alone, for my days are a breath. What are human beings that you make so much of them, that you set your mind on them, visit them every morning, test them every moment? Will you not look away from me for a while? Let me alone until I swallow my spittle. God looking upon human beings to Job is not a good thing. If this is your attention you pay to me, God, I can do without it. Note what he says here in 16, I loathe my life. 7:16. So the verb that's translated in NRSV, loathe, is a verb that's sometimes translated reject or abandon. We're going to see it again in the book. Ma'as, to reject. My life is like a breath. Here we have another word we've encountered before, kevel. It's that same word that Peleth uses when he says all is hevel, all is meaningless. In verse 21, he says, to the earth I lie down, or I shall lie in the earth. Here he uses a term, the term for that translated earth here could also be translated dust, afar.
And see that on this side.
Yeah, it's just, yeah. It should be. It's an ayin in Hebrew, which we mark with this mark. The word for dust, this word appears numerous times in the book. It's the expression dust and ashes that will come at the end of the book. We're going to have this word and one that looks almost just like it. Job's been sitting on the ash heap and dust thrown in the air over the head. These are signs of mourning. So when Job says, I will sit in the earth, it's this image of mourning again. Well, Job's complaint goes on. Finally, in chapter 23, Job says something that I think is really the key to what he's getting at here, where Job calls God into court, essentially. Today also my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his dwelling. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, but he would give heed to me. Job here seems to say, I won't be satisfied until I hear from God, the Creator. Chapter 31, 35 to 37, Job, again, at the end of his speeches, calls for God to come near. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me like a crown. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. Asking for a hearing before God. When we get to the end of Job's speeches here, then this character Elihu enters in chapters 32 to 37. This is one of those parts of the book that's been forever debated because we don't meet him in the beginning. He's not one of the three companions. We don't know of him otherwise. So who is he? Again, he speaks both against Job, but particularly against Job's friends and in defense of God. So chapter 33, verse 23 has an interesting statement. The poetry makes it impossible to know exactly what is being said, but Elihu says, then if there should be for one of them an angel, a mediator, one of 1,000, one who declares a person upright, and he is gracious to that person and says, deliver him from going down to the pit. I have found a ransom. This perhaps is Elihu's own reference to himself, which makes us wonder, is Elihu also a member of the heavenly court, one who steps out and enters this speech? It's a surprising section of the book because we expect at the end of Job's speeches to hear the speech of God, for God to enter, which God is going to do very soon. But instead we hear Elihu defending God and at times defending Job, arguing against Job's friends. And God's answer when it comes will be a bit different from Elihu's. So all kinds of proposals. Elihu, maybe his speeches were added later and so on. After Elihu, we get finally 38 to the speech of God. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. The Lord gives Job exactly what he was asking for, a direct hearing before the Creator. But it may not be quite what Job imagined. Job is imagining that he will lay his case before God, that he will bring charges against God. But God says, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me." And then essentially, of course, God takes Job on a little tour of the creation. Goes all around and asks the question, Job, where were you when all this was put in place? Is it by your power that this or that happens? That the sun rises and sets, that the seasons turn, that the animals of the created order take their place? How does all that happen? He goes to those inaccessible places of the earth, chapter 39, where mountain goats give birth and the deers calve, things that humans don't normally see. The first part of the speech of God ends with this question: shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? Anyone who argues with God must respond. And Job simply responds in his smallness. See, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, I will not answer twice, but I will proceed no further. Then God proceeds to out of the whirlwind again and continues this tour of creation. In chapter 40, he goes, and then 41, he goes to the two mysterious creatures that both represent chaos. Both of these seem to be drawn from Egyptian images of the forces of chaos. Behemoth is a representation, it seems, of the hippopotamus, which is, the most dangerous animal on the Nile. More people killed by hippopotamuses than any other animal, so they say. That's the first one, 40 verses 15 and following. And then 41, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down its tongue with a cord? The answer seems to be, of course, from God. I can do that. It's nothing for me. Leviathan here seems to be inspired then by the crocodile. The description of the multi layers of armor on its body is reflected in that. But fearsome though he may be to humans, he is nothing to God. All of this in no way answers Job's complaint about why this is happening to him. It reflects the mystery of the creation and the way things work. Job then finally, at the end of the poetry, responds to the Lord. I know that you can do all, this is 42, 2. I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear and I will speak. I will question you and declare, and you declare to me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. So the one thing that's clear here is that Job's response to God expresses satisfaction that what Job has asked for, Job has gotten. An audience with the Creator. God has shown up. God has addressed Job directly, and Job stands in humility before God. What's not clear is what the last verse of this speech means. And yet this is the crux of Job's final speech, and in a way, the meaning of the book as a whole. NRSV translates, "Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." There are a number, now this translation is assuming that what Job essentially is saying is that he's going back to the ash heap from chapter 2. He's sitting on the ashes in repentance before God, having heard God, being been toured around the creation by God, and receiving from God this new perspective on the mysteries of the magnificence of creation. But there are a number of things about that that don't make sense, that is, about that translation. First of all, remember that Job has never left the ash heap. That's, in fact, the problem of the book, it seems. It seems to be the problem the friends have with him, that, in fact, he's continued to sit there the whole time. And the sentence itself doesn't lend itself to this translation all that well. The first expression in the translation, "I despise myself," just make a few notes here. The verb he uses is the same verb he used back over in chapter 7 when he said, I reject my life. The verb but in Hebrew it doesn't have an object. And there is no middle voice in Hebrew. It simply says, I reject or abandon. Abandon what? Reject what? Translators have assumed he's talking about himself, that this is again pointing back to his repentance that he should return to. The second part of the sentence also doesn't neatly lend itself to the translation. In dust and ashes. Well, and also maybe repent as well. Repent is okay, but it doesn't have to mean, it doesn't have to have a religious sense or the sense of penitence. It can simply have the sense of changing one's mind or being sorry or something like that. But in dust and ashes, the preposition here is not the one we expect if it's talking about going back to the ash heap and sitting on that or in a pile of ashes. The preposition might better be translated here concerning. So what Job may be saying here is I've changed my mind about dust and ashes. Not about the ash heap, but about human existence. For the words dust and ashes, the two words dust and ashes, two words that look almost the same in Hebrew and sound almost the same, are the same words back from chapter 7, or one of the words from chapter 7, when he said, I sit in the earth. He's talking about the end of his life, the worthlessness of his existence. So it's possible that Job here, after hearing from God, is reflecting not so much on his complaint in general and charging God, but on his what he has been arguing about human existence and about the creation, that it's meaningless, that it has no purpose. And that, it would seem, is a better take on what Job concludes at the end of his speech. Let me say a word about the conclusion to the book, and then I want to propose a couple of things that Job maybe says to us. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken what is right, as my servant Job has." God affirms all that Job has said, his complaint, his arguments against retribution theology, all seems to be fine. The three companions, in arguing that somehow Job must be guilty of something, which is where their argument went eventually. Since Job won't leave the ash heap, he must have something that he's hiding. That's where they go in the end. God says, no, all that's wrong. And Job prays for his friends, and the Lord accepts Job's prayer, verse 9. Then the Lord restored the fortunes of Job. He has twice as much as he ever had. He gets 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. And the way this ends in the description of the children is really kind of remarkable. He had, verse 13, 7 sons and 3 daughters. He named, speaking of the daughters, he named the first Jemimah, the second Keziah, and the third Karen Hapuk. That the daughters are named is really unique. This, though, by the way, is also something that appears in the Baal myth. His daughters are named, but not his sons. But what comes next is really unique. In all the land, there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this, Job lived 140 years. And saw his children and his children's children 4 generations. And Job died old and full of years. In the ancient Near East, typically daughters did not get an inheritance. This is, and you know this from the narratives in Numbers and in Joshua, there were special cases where there were no male heirs, and so inheritance was given, the land of the promised land given to daughters. The daughters of Zelophehad, the primary example. But that's raised exactly because this is unexpected. And the point there is the land is going to get distributed to every family. No one's going to be left out. But if there are sons there, the daughters are not going to get an inheritance. They will get their inheritance through the people they marry and so on. These 3 daughters are given an inheritance by their father. What does all this mean? Again, it doesn't answer for us in any way the problem of suffering. So I want to just propose 2 things that it may mean for us. The first one is sacramental. The book as a whole has a lot to do with rites of mourning. And the conclusion to the book, if that 6th verse of chapter 42 is rendered as I've suggested, we might take it to mean then that Job's friends have come and they've tried to bring him out of his mourning. They're comforters in that technical sense. They sit with him for 7 days, and at the end of that, they're supposed to help him move on with life. But Job refuses. Job's complaint is that I will move only when God comes and acts as a comforter. And remarkably, God does. So it tells us something incredibly important about who God is. That in our suffering, there is not a neat explanation for it, but God is present. God is with us. And the book as a whole argues against this notion that you can see immediate reward for good deeds and immediate punishment for evil deeds. That doesn't work, as the complaints of the Psalms tell us as well. But God is present in that suffering. And secondly, there's a kind of developmental and theological message to the book. Job's character seems to grow over the course of the book. We should expect this, I suppose, when God has encountered you in a whirlwind, after you've been complaining that God's not listening and God's not paying attention. When God shows up, it will surely change you. And it does seem to change Job. I think one of the ways he's changed is indicated by the description of the restoration of Job. The 7 sons and 3 daughters. The fact that the 3 daughters have names and that he gives them an inheritance. Maybe says something about who Job has become. Remember at the beginning, Job makes sacrifices for his children who are off partying together in case they haven't done it for themselves. Job at the beginning is a kind of stuffed shirt, you know. He is meticulously religious, pious, covering all his bases, but there's no indication that he has any depth of relationship with his children. Perhaps he has, but his main concern is that he covers their potential sins. In the end, however, he names his daughters and gives them an inheritance, a sign that Job perhaps has grown into a genuine human being with deep relationship and appreciation for all he has and for the Creator who has given it to him. But I'm going to stop there and yeah, that's right. I mean, it's unique in its structure and development, but it does kind of, in general, reflect that movement of those prayers for help. It contains a lot of the kind of Job's speeches anyway, contain a lot of the kind of complaints that we have in those prayers for help. The complaint that the wicked are flourishing, for example. Well, I would say not really. The number of years decreases even in Genesis, you know, till we get to the patriarchs, and the numbers begin to go down to something more regular, and we get to Moses, who dies at 120. But Job, this 120 mark, though, seems to be the ideal, and that Job surpasses that. That seems to be the message here. Yeah, and it's just an idea. It's chapter 33. It's verse 23. He's the references are not quite clear. You know, is he talking of himself here, speaking, mediating for Job? If so, maybe that's what he's saying. If one should come as an angel, a mediator. Is that who he is? It's not at all clear who this Elihu is. You know.
Introduced.
Yeah, he just shows up,
Yeah.
and we got to wonder where did he come from? And so that's one proposal, you know, for how we might understand him. Otherwise, he's just a mysterious voice here. Well, it's sort of the opposite of that high view of humankind that we met in Psalm 8. And it's even, remember in Psalm 144 asks the same question and gives a negative answer, but it doesn't say human life is meaningless. It just says it's brief. It's humans can't compare to God, and human ability is limited. You know, all that's basically what it's doing, and it's part of a royal speech that calls into question the nature of human rulers, really. But Job goes further to just say, what is the purpose of human existence? There seems to be none. And then as he moves on with it, I mean, just read through chapter 7. It's a great speech, albeit depressing, the place he's in. But he goes to the place of saying, you know, Lord, why do you pay any attention to us at all? We'd be better off if you didn't. If your gaze was turned away from us completely, so that we wouldn't try to claim that we're somehow part of some purpose that you have, you know. And the curse of his birthday, of course, in chapter 3 is the start of all. Yeah, well, I think the question is, does it work? You know, and Job is one place where if you've bought into it, Job really questions, well, does this really ring true? And it seems not to ring true. Not that it doesn't. Well, it's a complicated story, isn't it? Because in the end, he's rewarded again. But if that's going to be the experience, we can't expect that you just do something right and you get rewarded. It's not that simple. So while Job gets his possessions back in the end, in the middle, he goes through this incredible suffering, even though he has done nothing to deserve it. You know, that's the point. And it can befall any of us. And we simply can't say, well, so-and-so, she's getting what she deserves. It's not that simple. And so Job is a great protest against that idea. That idea put in kind of simplistic form. You know, even like Psalm 1 expresses retribution theology, as we talked about. There are two ways, and one's rewarded and one's not. But when you continue to read, what you recognize is this is not something that happens immediately. You can't tell this just blow by blow. This happens to you because you did something wrong. It's not like that at all. We're on a path of trust in God, and eventually that pays off. But we don't know when that payoff is going to come. That's what I was getting after. Yeah, more the caricature of retribution theology. Yeah, I mean, that's the presentation here. Now that gets developed over time. Right? This character gets reinterpreted, and the label comes to be not so much accuser as tempter, you know. But I think, yeah, so I think we have to take the story of Job. Well, Brown puts it well when he says it's sort of a thought experiment. You know, I mean, how would anybody know, first off, that this has gone on in the heavenly realm? The narrator's telling us all this, not even claiming to be a prophetic figure who's there reporting for us, just this happened. How do we know that? Well, it invites us to think about such things. And this, in the thought experiment, this is the character who would have done who would prompted this kind of action against a figure like Job, the one who's been going out looking for wrongdoing all along, trying to locate it, and can't find anything with him. But let's see if he will give into it. If he will give up on his faith in God, if he suffers a little bit. He's being set up by the accuser, but God goes along with it. It's part of the mystery of this. But it's another reason, I think, reading literally, or reading everything as a historical account, makes it really difficult theologically to embrace something like this. To think that God is somehow up there playing games with our lives, that's not the point of the story. That's the kind of take on it, in fact, that someone like Christopher Hitchens, might have. So we have to be more sophisticated than that and recognize what the book is trying to do, I think. Yeah, that's right. But Job keeps his faith, but he also, the dialogue show us he's not the patient figure that he gets labeled as, He doesn't sound too patient at times, but that's okay. His faith is expressed in his complaint. He doesn't give up on the idea that maybe God will hear me. I'm going to keep calling, and eventually God answers and comes directly. That's really a remarkable movement in the book. Okay, thank you all.